Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our Member Spotlight series from the Faith for Earth Youth Council on human rights, environment, and faith. I'm delighted to be joined by Zahra today. She's one of our members and is also the head of community development at the Bahu Trust. And it's really great to have you with us, Zahra. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your work and how it relates to this intersection that we're exploring over the course of the next couple of Member Spotlights videos. Just to get started, I'd be curious to hear a bit more about your work at the Bahu Trust and also your involvement in the council and getting a better understanding of how you see the intersection between faith, human rights, and environment in that work.
Thanks so much, Christian. I'm really delighted to be joining you today. My name is Zahra Ahmad. I'm a youth council member and also the regional representative for the UK for Faith for Earth Youth Council. I was recently appointed to the Bahu Trust as head of community development. So the Bahu Trust is an organization and movement committed to empowering and strengthening marginalised communities, serving the most vulnerable sections of society within Birmingham and beyond. So essentially, it was founded in the 1980s as a mosque and community hub by two renowned sheikhs within Birmingham. But it originated from a desire to preserve the message of God and convey that to the community and sort of spread the teachings of Islam and its message. But it operates with two primary functions, so serving the religious needs of the community as well as serving the holistic needs of the community through community development programs, supporting religious services, but also combating social injustice, inequality, and, working to advance the mental, physical, psychological, and spiritual health and well-being of the communities that we serve. So that's just a bit of background around the organization, and I'm mainly responsible for, seeking funding, devising different programs for the community, with a particular interest in young people and women.
So it's really fascinating work, and we've been doing a little bit in collaboration with you through the council, and that's been really wonderful to hear about how that work and how sort of the Islamic perspective is influencing the work that you're doing. And in that vein, I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit how your personal faith, but then also sort of your work and its connection to Islam, how that inspires you to think about human rights and the environment. And I'm wondering specifically also in your context, if there are any connections between those two that you focus on in particular.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a really good question. I mean, I think from a young age, I've always been inspired by my parents, who are very much situated within humanitarian work and charitable work. And I think my father's inspiration is primarily the teachings of Islam. And so that guides a lot of the work that he's done throughout his life. And I think that sort of was passed down to me. And I think I really internalized the core tenets of Islam, which he advocates for, which is all around social justice. And I think faith does underpin my drive to serve others and alleviate human suffering, advocating for the rights of the most marginalized and othered communities around the world. A core principle of Islam is to promote social justice and reduce inequality. And obviously, we're living in an increasingly unequal world where the disparity between rich and poor, privilege and poverty widens every day. And so I think it's imperative to draw on teachings of faith to guide efforts towards reducing human suffering and seeking a more just and equal world. And Islam is among many other faiths and many other spiritual traditions, really advocates for reducing inequality and injustice. I think it's actually one of the most key principles, I think, of being a Muslim. And, giving, charitable giving is a huge aspect of Islam in terms of zakat, that it, is sort of prescribed upon Muslims to, if they're able to donate a certain percentage of their wealth to poor and needy causes. And I think the fact that it's so embedded within the faith and the community, it just demonstrates, the intrinsic importance of charitable giving and, upholding human rights and supporting different communities.
So, and how does the environment come into that? Because we talk a lot at the Youth Council about the global scale of the climate crisis, but then also the local impacts of it and how there is often a profound intersection between human rights abuses or the lack of human rights and the environmental crisis. So I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to that as well.
I think just to draw on some of the work that my organization, the Bahu Trust, does, we are accredited with United Nations Environment Programme. We're actually the only mosque, as far as I know, in the world to have UNEP accreditation, which I think is incredible because we are a grassroots organization. You know, we are a mosque-based organization with an award in Birmingham, and I think that in itself is a huge achievement to have the link between a religious institution and a United Nations sort of body in that sense. But in terms of, you know, how we approach the environment, we recognize at the Bahu Trust that it's our moral imperative as custodians of this fragile earth to take responsibility of the environment and seek to protect human life, preserve ecosystems and the natural world. And, you know, we don't have to look too far to see the scale of degradation and climate crisis, you know, triple planetary crisis. But at the Bahu Trust, we believe that preserving the environment is an act of worship and that the faith of Islam provides a clear mandate to protect and look after nature. So we're striving to ensure that our education and spirituality encompasses the aspect of Islam and the environment in different ways. For instance, you know, installing solar panels and energy saving measures, sharing teachings on how to reduce food waste and car miles, and encouraging the local community to walk or cycle to the mosque where possible, and raising awareness around individual actions and choices that we can make in terms of reducing food waste, in terms of recycling, you know, reducing air pollution. And one of the key aspects to our success is education of our imams and religious leaders. So we recognize that, you know, there's a certain position of respect and influence held by imams, faith leaders, and therefore we try to link the two. So we marry the two by designing and delivering training to imams on the environment, so that they can then disseminate that to their congregation, so that as well as, you know, spreading the teachings of Islam and sort of the religious, you know, duties, we're also embedding the importance of the environment seamlessly with our sermons. And that's a, you know, quite a innovative way of utilizing our faith leaders to promote environmental awareness.
Definitely, no, that's interesting, and I'm interested in the way that you use the term moral imperative, because often we hear at the UN level, particularly around COP29, there's this sort of reference to morality, the morality of climate action, the need for climate action, because it is a moral imperative. And the way that you have worked to incorporate that into spiritual practices and spiritual communication is something that I think is quite interesting, and I think you're right, sort of creative and a new way of bringing about these conversations in different settings. What, in your opinion, and maybe from your own perspective, but then also more broadly, sort of what does your faith teach you about this relationship between human well-being and the environment?
I think just from a personal level, I can see, you know, at an individual level that human well-being and the environment is so intrinsically linked, and that human well-being relies on the state of nature and the environment. You know, when we witness things like air pollution, land degradation, oceans being destroyed by plastic waste, you know, our health relies on the health of the planet. And so connecting with our earth on an individual level even is important to supporting our well-being in terms of access to clean green spaces and just taking a walk in the park, you know, when it's winter time as well. We can see just the benefits for our body and for our mind. But on a deeper level, our faith teaches us to be stewards and guardians of the earth and to protect the gift that God has bestowed upon us, to care and look after. You know, in Islam, we believe that the earth is an amana, which means responsibility. In the same way that our bodies have been given to us as a responsibility that we look after, the earth itself is a huge responsibility. And I think this idea of vicegerents and custodians is shared across all major faiths. And I think that's a really interesting and important, you know, ecological link in terms of the commitment to the ecological sort of space is shared among all faith traditions. I think the aspect that nature and the earth is sacred is a core tenet of the faith. But also in terms of, you know, there's a lot of scripture and, you know, teachings within scripture and hadith that refer to the ways in which the earth will speak, at the end of, after on the day of judgment, or, the earth itself will speak and sort of give its own narrative or narration of what's been done to it, right? So the same way that, we see other human beings and creatures, I mean, the earth itself will testify in terms of what has it seen and what, so it's not the idea that trees and living creatures are just less valuable and don't share the same value as humans is just not true in terms of, maybe not on a sentient sort of level, but you see just the way in which trees and the earth can hold so much spiritual and moral significance. I think caring for them, even on the basis of not cutting down trees, for instance, is a huge way to protect the planet. I think I don't know if I've explained that very well, but in terms of Islam, like we're told that preservation of nature is huge, and sort of the idea that there's a verse which is that we have been granted this sweet and green earth, and God has made you custodians over it, right? So this idea is a really core tenet of Islam, and the idea that we are custodians and stewards. But also in terms of environmental awareness, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was also known to really reduce his meat consumption. He barely ate meat. He was very much, in some ways like a vegetarian, and he was very sort of modest in terms of how he conducted his life. And I think the teachings of the Prophet's life and his example is a big influence for a lot of Muslims and how they live, especially when you think about sustainability. The Prophet's teachings really highlighted the importance of sustainability when it comes to wastefulness. And there's a big ethos within Islam about not wasting, whether it comes to food or anything else. We're told about al-mizan, the balance, which basically refers to the idea that everything should be in moderation, and upsetting that balance is what will lead to devastation and destruction, which is exactly what we're seeing now with the current climate and ecological crisis.
Yeah, no, definitely. And we've had a lot of members who I've spoken to about this topic say one of the things that stuck out is we can't survive without the earth, but the earth can survive without us. And that balance again that you mentioned is something that often perhaps we get a bit mixed up. It's interesting that you mentioned Al Mizan, because I think the Bahu Trust, as well as the UNEP Faith Earth Initiative, has been quite involved in the production of a major document called Al Mizan, which is a covenant for the earth. Sort of the way I've heard it compared it to is sort of a Muslim equivalent to Laudato Si, where it's sort of drawing on theological tradition and teaching to speak then into this particular issue. And I'm wondering if you could speak perhaps a little bit about that document in and of itself.
Just to briefly touch upon Al-Mizan, so my colleague Kamran Shahzad, he's the director of the Bahu Trust. He was a key author responsible for, the Al-Mizan document, which is a covenant for the earth, which is equivalent to Laudato Si in terms of being one of the first documents which clearly outlines the scientific, environmental, ecological, ethical framework for combating the climate crisis and environmental issues. And it's a very academic text, but it's been, convened and collated with a number of scholars to create this document. I think it's one of its kind, really. It's a very unique document promoting environmental issues and sustainability, and the connections between Islam and what Islam teaches us and our current climate crisis and the environmental issues. But I think just in terms of, the environmental crisis and how to address it, I think we can't shy away from the moral and spiritual crisis that's plaguing our world at the moment. I think understanding the history of industrialization, capitalism, corporate greed, all these forces that work together to destroy the planet, ultimately, need to be understood. And I think, that's creating this consumer society in which accessing joy and satisfaction is achieved at the click of a button with, purchasing something or basically trying to ignore the spiritual void that a lot of us feel by buying something and filling that hole with other sort of irrelevant consumer goods, I think, in some ways. I think in terms of the faith communities and what role we play, we play a pivotal role because those belonging to faith traditions represent a large proportion of the world. And therefore, if faith leaders, faith institutions, and secular institutions together were propagating which they are, right? The dire need for supporting the environment and protecting our earth, I think it would be huge. And in terms of young people, I think they need to be reading about the environment, understanding the interconnected nature of, the interconnectedness of environmental, social, and ethical issues, and that they're not divorced from one another. They're actually one and the same. And ultimately, young people of faith and none will be inheriting the world, which has irreversibly been altered due to the climate crisis. And it's their responsibility and ours as young people of faith to build, the just, equal, and protected earth that we want to see and live in. And in terms of, here in Birmingham in the UK and beyond, I think we in the West have an even more there's an even more, I think, demanding moral onus on us to do more to protect the earth, considering industrialization and the fact that a lot of the West are responsible for the climate catastrophe, which communities in the global South are bearing the brunt of, right? And I think, again, in redressing the balance, it would start here. It would start in the UK. It would start in the West. And I think, as people who have been afforded the privilege of education, university education, etc., even as a basic need, we definitely hold responsibility. And I think it's really easy to switch off and to sort of swipe away that responsibility, especially in the age of social media. And I think there's a lot that we're grappling with as young people, but I think if we're able to use social media as a tool, or creativity as a tool to address some of these challenges, it would be a start.
Yeah, I think you're right that there's an underlying issue of greed and sort of spiritual failure in some ways, and faith communities can speak a counter narrative into that and to say, no, hold on, maybe life's not just about accumulating wealth, gathering this power. There's a counter narrative that comes through the lessons of through the discipline of faith, that faith communities can speak into this discussion. I mean, in restoring the balance, and I think we saw that at COP29 and COP28 with the Faith Pavilion, that there is sort of a new way of thinking about this issue that has been emerging on the international scene, and that hopefully will continue in years to come. And I'm really glad that you mentioned young people and the role of young people, because we are, of course, the Faith for Earth Youth Council. And so we think a lot about how can we equip young individuals such as yourself and all our other members around the world to better engage in these discussions. And so to conclude, I'm just curious, and I wanted to ask, what advice would you give to young people who are looking, particularly young people of faith, who are looking to be engaged in the environmental discussions? What resources do you have for them? How can they access these spaces? How can they be a part of these spaces, and how can they contribute to these spaces? And what would you recommend as someone who's very active in these spaces to those individuals watching this video or following our work in some shape or form?
No, thank you so much. I think just to return to something you said just a second ago, that, the Faith Pavilion is a huge moment. And, I attended COP28 last year in Dubai, and seeing the Faith Pavilion was, a really exciting moment. But I think it's almost, there's a mismatch between, that recognition of faith communities and maybe now it's, the international community or, high-level leaders are recognizing the importance of faith institutions. But when you actually think about it, indigenous and religious communities have long existed, in terms of caring for the earth. The spiritual connection between us and the earth has long existed, long before the Faith Pavilion, right? And so I just find it interesting that we're sort of gaining this recognition now by world leaders, when, perhaps it's long overdue that, faith communities and indigenous communities are granted a seat at the table. And I think it's often marginalized voices that don't get the seat at the table. And I think that's why the importance of youth voices, indigenous voices, religious voices, voices of faith are so important in this conversation. And I think in terms of young people, what can they do? What advice I'd give? I think creativity is an incredibly important tool, and especially in the age of social media and digital storytelling. And I think a lot of young people are facing this moral and spiritual void, where, they're being bombarded with like content and media at an unimaginable scale in terms of, social media and how that interacts with young people and especially their mental health. And I think they definitely have a choice to make in terms of grappling with the consumer society we live in and this moral, spiritual call to protect the earth. But I think utilizing tools like social media, creativity in terms of art and creativity, poetry, for instance, I think is a really important tool to express how they're feeling in this age of climate crisis, and to then take it a step further and advocate for the rights of those who can't, or the rights of those marginalized populations who perhaps don't have a seat at the table or don't have the same privileges afforded to us in the West, and to tell those stories and narrate those stories as well as their own. But I think a commitment to uplifting marginalized voices is really important for young people. And yeah, I mean, finally, just to say, like, I think ultimately, those stories need to be told. And I think young people have, the gift of social media and these kind of tools to tell those stories. But I think working in your local community is a really great way to start, because most communities in the UK, cities, etc., lack green spaces. There's a lot of issues around, growing your own food, etc. So I think even volunteering with your local, community, garden, etc., these kind of areas would be a great way to start, just to sort of reconnect with the earth in a local scale, and also just, volunteering for charities that, are raising environmental awareness, etc. And I think the grassroots is an incredibly important space to then influence policy and other spaces. I think the voice of the grassroots has to be platformed more, and I think that's the last message I'd finish on.
Well, it's a good message to finish on. Thank you so much, Zahra. It's been great chatting with you and hearing your perspective, and look forward to following along with your work going forward.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.